Welcome everybody to Thinking Like a Mountain, Design Pedagogy for Climate Crisis. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. My name is Douglas Robb, and I'm a sessional lecturer in landscape architecture at the Daniels faculty. Along with my two co-organizers, Sam Dufault and Kelly Doran, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the fifth event in our winter program entitled Thinking Like a Mountain, Design Pedagogy for Climate Crisis, with our incredible guest speakers, Stephanie Carlile, Rosetta Elen, Joseph Griema, and Scott McCaulay. Now, today's program is a conversation about what it means to be a design student, teacher, and practitioner in a time of increasing climatological uncertainty. How can students find a collective voice to advocate for change in design practice and pedagogy while also coping with the pressures of climate anxiety? How can teachers prepare their students for an uncertain future and for a professional and academic discipline that is currently undergoing rapid social, political, and technological change? And how can practitioners draw from the work that's currently being done in design schools in order to challenge the unsustainable norms and standards of professional practice and to collectively build more just and inclusive climate futures? These are just some of the questions that Sam, Kelly, and I set out to address when we were invited to collaborate on this event. In practical terms, we sought to understand how design schools like Daniels might better equip students to become activists and agents for change. For example, what changes would need to happen with respect to course content and offerings? And how can teaching and research better inform professional practice and accreditation processes? Where can we learn from the success of other design institutions? And crucially, how can we celebrate our own climate leadership at Daniels with broader audiences? Conceptually, we were also interested in unpacking the vocabularies and narratives that we use to talk about the climate crisis in our studios and in our classrooms. How might these narratives help or sometimes even hinder our ultimate goals of decarbonization and climate justice? And so all of these questions led us to the title of today's event, Thinking Like a Mountain, which we borrow from the American author and conservationist Aldo Leopold. In his book, A Sand County Almanac, Leopold invites readers to reflect on the profound interconnectedness of the natural world by thinking like a mountain. That is, to engage in a kind of thought experiment to try and extend our individual human consciousness by assuming a more holistic, or in Leopold's terms, an ecological perspective. To think like a mountain means accepting the limits of one's own partial understanding of the world, and to acknowledge that we're all relational beings connected to each other and to our environments. Leopold's invitation to see the world through plural perspectives provides a kind of conceptual starting point for today's conversation. And now, in calling us to think like mountains, my co-organizers and I aren't suggesting that we should project human desires and ambitions onto the non-human world, because doing so would deny the radical alterity of non-human life, which is both anthropocentric and deeply depoliticizing. Rather, we're interested in working with and through multiple narratives and perspectives in order to expand how we approach the climate change and the climate crisis through our design pedagogy. So, for example, is it correct to attribute climate change mainly to carbon? Or does this narrative distract critical attention away from the systems of accumulation and extractive capitalism that have turned carbon, the fundamental building block of organic life on Earth, into an existential threat? Should we think about the climate crisis as a recent event or as a longer historical process that began, say, with the rise of modernism, or maybe with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, or as Kyle Powys-White and Zoe Todd suggest, with the colonization and biophysical transformation of what we now call the Americas? My point here is that narratives matter, both practically and conceptually. And they matter because they set into motion a whole series of trajectories that determine how we teach, how we learn, and how we design in response to the climate crisis. And today, I'm so excited to discuss these ideas with our esteemed guest panelists, and to think about how they might start to transform design pedagogy at Daniels and at other design institutions around the world. So now, before we begin, just a brief note on today's format. I'll introduce our first speaker, Scott McCaulay, who will then briefly share his thoughts in a short presentation. And my co-organizers, Sam and Kelly, will then introduce themselves and the following speakers. After these sort of opening words, the panelists will then take part in a moderated discussion that should last until roughly 10 minutes past 1 p.m. And afterwards, we'll open the floor to audience questions. And I welcome everyone to please ask your own questions through the Q&A button located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Scott McCaulay. Scott is a climate justice activist, architectural designer, and climate literacy educator. Scott, over to you.
All right, thank you very, very much. As a lovely introduction, I will try not to talk too fast, got a habit of it. But yes, so to introduce myself, my name's Scott, I use he and him, and I am an practicing architectural assistant, part 2, and I also run a School of Architecture unintentionally. So in 2018, we had that report, the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees. And the architectural education system and practice did not respond to a report saying how little time we had left to radically overhaul civilization. This is not just a slight tweaking of the system, it had to be an unprecedented one. So to introduce my own work, I coordinate the Anthropocene Architecture School. So this was launched an open provocation on the provocation that Scotland's architecture fringe, that architectural education is obsolete in the face of climate breakdown. Because we were and still are teaching students as if we are still living in a normality we can sustain, which we simply cannot. So I chose the word the Anthropocene for several reasons, one of which is that in architecture, we are still designing as if it's about the 1970s. We're incredibly far behind. And the Anthropocene is a geological epoch that is defined by human activity, but most significantly, carbon-intensive, extractive, state-led fossil fuel industry-led activity has dramatically reshaped our planet. And the buildings we've been designing have not radically changed to respond to this. So the reality of a climate emergency is that we have very little time to radically reduce the amount of carbon we emit, but also to reconcile our relationship with the natural world. Because it's not just about carbon. We've had this distinct siloing of humans from nature, because what we would consider a kind of normality or modernism is entirely dependent upon sacrificial lives, sacrificial landscapes, and sacrificial communities. So this could not be sustained without that happening. But also just to say that the IPCC report in 2018 was very, very clear about how the built environment must radically transform. So by 2050, it should have its carbon emissions cut by 80 to 90%. So that is almost as huge. But then when you look at that in more detail, every new building should have been near zero energy and fossil free by 2020. That is the minimum baseline for what you should be preparing designers to deliver. So if design schools cannot teach students to design buildings that are going to be near zero energy and fossil free, they are failing those students, and those students are not being prepared for the realities of practicing in the Anthropocene. But on top of that as well, if we look at, I'm currently in Scotland, but if you look at the UK, if we want to hit our legally binding climate targets, we need to retrofit one home every 35 seconds. And that's the minimum baseline for our target that is entirely ignoring historical responsibilities for kicking off the Industrial Revolution and the amount of colonization that stemmed from the United Kingdom. But just to drag it into where my own work sits, so I do a lot of work in climate literacy. So climate literacy is something that has been missing from design education and the education as a whole for decades. This is something that's no one's fault. It's grown up out of the system. But this means there's a disconnect between designers knowing the impacts that climate change is having on what they're designing and how what they're designing is impacting climate change. But on top of that, it's not preparing them to really not capitalize, wrong word, we don't use that word. So we're really looking to make the most of these multi-solving solutions. So then lots of the work I do brings an agency. So I led a studio workshop to prepare part of the Manchester School of Architecture for a workshop called Some Kind of Nature. So as part of that, I did a preparatory workshop for a group of students on agency and about reimagining our future, because if we are going to imagine a future that is not entirely dependent upon sacrificing our natural world, we need to reimagine what infrastructure is, reimagine relationships between nature and the built environment and reconcile that. But just to put into a little bit of context, how big an impact can we have in the built environment? So the average kind of carbon emissions per capita of a UK citizen is 12.7 tonnes. The average embodied carbon of a large project is 2,500 tonnes. So that means there's about 196 times bigger impact that designers can be having in that context in their work, instead of simply focusing on the small, tiny changes you can make to your own life. But if we're going to be preparing students to practice in a world where we're going to really put justice at the heart of it, because we need to have a just transition that's not just nationally in countries, this has to be a global effort. And we need to look at the justice. So really stress that if you look at historical emissions, 92% of those came from the global north. We have this huge responsibility to drive emissions down far sooner than 2050. Before 2040, 2030 has to be complete, kind of true zero for those countries that have really pushed this beyond what we can sustain. But if we are not preparing students and showing them where they have agency, not just before they graduate, not just after they graduate, but showing them they can have a massive impact before, we are effectively teaching in denial, because if this is not just professionals who are doing it, this is an entire society kind of collective endeavor. So just to kind of wrap up my own kind of part, I hope I've not overshot too much, but we really need to put agency at the heart of what we're teaching. We need to make sure that our courses are climate literate, that they are preparing students for the reality in which they are practicing, not just the reality of what's been taught on your course for the past 10 years. So your design briefs are going to have to change. But also we need to bring in the imagination in a really radical sense. So right to the roots of what we design, how we teach, and look at how we can put a truly regenerative culture at the heart of all of that as well. And I will wrap before another tangent begins and pass on.
Thank you, Scott. My name is Sam Dufault, and I am an assistant professor teaching stream at the Daniels faculty. I would now like to welcome Joseph Griema. Joseph is an architect, critic, curator, writer, and co-founder of the design research studio Space Caviar. Joseph?
Hi, thank you, Sam. Thank you all for putting together this event. It's really a pleasure to be to have the opportunity to discuss these topics. And I think, I agree with so much of what Scott said, and I think in many ways I'll be saying it again in different words, and that'll probably be a kind of recurring theme throughout the evening. But I think in a good way. My personal sort of take on the idea of thinking like a mountain, I think this is a very beautiful way of framing the question that we have in front of us, is also, like Scott's, driven very much by an attempt to establish the possibility of alternative discourse, partly within the framework, pedagogical framework, schools, universities, like the one we're speaking in right now, but also in terms of like reframing the question of sustainability in the face of a broader audience, towards the kind of a more general public. And in some ways, you could sort of somewhat polemically frame my interests in this topic as almost like a rant against sustainability. I think, obviously, we're here all, it's a given that we're here to talk in support of the topic, but I think, in a way, one of the biggest obstacles that any sort of progress needs to overcome is the word sustainability itself. Because very empirical observations lead me to believe that the word sustainability leads in one of two directions, either to an extremely high level academic discourse and a very kind of science-based approach, a very kind of academically solid and competent approach on the one hand, or on the other end of the spectrum, and it's almost an approach that sees it as a marketing tool and that instrumentalizes it for the purposes of actually selling more stuff. And that, in a way, the kind of the absence of anything that sort of pulls it out of that perceptive arena in the minds of a broader public is, in my mind, one of the biggest obstacles that we face in terms of actually making any substantial progress in this field. together with my studio, the studio that I founded, Space Caviar, that Sam mentioned, we recently completed, in fact, just last week, a year-long research project hosted by VAC Foundation in Venice, part of which led to it actually began with the publication of this book, Non-Extractive Architecture on Designing Without Depletion, Volume 1. And that was a kind of a preamble to the project, and now Volume 2 is going to be coming out shortly. Volume 1 mostly collects essays, reflections on this idea of designing without depletion. Volume 2 is mostly a series of a compendium of case studies and kind of empirical experiments in attempting to implement a non-extractive architecture in the real world. And our goal with this project was really to try to offer almost like a toolkit, not to kind of define or to establish any sort of boundaries around this idea of non-extractive architecture, but to, in a way, kind of offer, to complicate, you could say, the word sustainability, to strip it a little bit, to kind of take a step back from all of these assumptions and all the baggage that it carries, and to actually look at the true complexity without any sort of filters or without any compromises, at the true complexity of what it means to build sustainably. And this idea of non-extractive architecture, obviously, in a way, is oxymoronic. We realize that, and in setting out to conduct this research, we realized the impossibility of a non-extractive architecture. Architecture is inherently extractive. It's something that, in a way, it's possibly the kind of primordial motivation for extraction that has driven humans. But at the same time, is something that is completely unrecognized. It's something that I think within the educational frameworks that exist today, certainly kind of based on my own experience as a student, the consequences of what it means to build is something that's completely disregarded. And the main goal of this project is not to kind of carry out any sort of value judgment on whether building is legitimate or not, although that's something that we're absolutely willing to consider. But it's more thinking broadly about the consequences of building and actually kind of looking at the bigger picture of what it means for us as a species to assume that a sort of a perpetual process of progressive colonization of our planet, and possibly soon others, what does that mean? And what does it mean for different stakeholders, understood as different sort of segments of our society, of our species? And so when we start to kind of examine what the consequence of this, all sorts of things start to, you start to kind of realize all sorts of very interesting things, such as that a lot of the assumptions that underpin the field of architecture, the field of construction, start to fall away. For example, one of these, I think, just to kind of give a general example, is the Jevons paradox. So much discourse around the increase in energy efficiency and sustainability hinges on technological progress and the idea that advancement in efficiency is somehow going to save us. But looking to kind of the field of economics, Jevons postulated that, in fact, increases in efficiency often lead to an increase in consumption rather than a decrease. And that's actually kind of handily, I was reading the other day an article that statistically, obviously kind of electric cars, we all know that's the future, we're transitioning towards electric. Statistically, Tesla drivers actually drive 1.6% more than other drivers, partly because the cost is reduced, partly presumably because of a more enjoyable experience and so on. But this idea of actually that somehow technology can save us, I think is one that is obviously to a large extent true. It's one that we need to take a closer look at. And I think that the field of economics is one that architecture needs to engage with much more deeply. And in that sense, one of the kind of the principal ideas that we've been kind of examining is and one of the principles that's necessary to kind of consider and to understand, and that I think should play a much larger role in the educational frameworks of our pedagogical institutions, is the idea of the concept of externalities. In other words, hidden costs that are paid by a third party as a consequence of a transaction between two other parties. And of course, carbon emissions are probably the most sort of glaring example of that. It's a consequence of an individual action that is paid, the price of which is paid for by collectivity, or in some cases by individuals. And And so to a large extent, the idea of non-extractive architecture advocates simply the inclusion of externalities in the balance sheet of architecture. Like, how do we actually begin to consider not simply the cost of purchasing on a free market basis the materials needed to our building, and obviously kind of the costs of running the building, and if we're lucky, maybe the cost of dismantling it and decommissioning in the future, but really the kind of the consequences, the costs, the externalities that are involved in the extraction of the materials, the accountability, and when we talk about the costs, we talk about not only the material costs, which are obviously a very important one and represent the bulk of the environmental impact of building, but also the social costs. What kind of labor is necessary? What kind of working conditions are implicit in the budget sheet of our building, and what are the cultural implications? What kind of social values are being upheld by this building, and what others are being suppressed? So all of these ideas, and the kind of as a point of arrival, I think, is the recognition of these costs and thinking about how, in fact, environmentally responsible construction can be made efficient. And of course, today it's not efficient simply because externalities are not factored into the budget. It's a completely unlevel playing field in environmental terms. And so what are the mechanisms through which we can bring these back in? Again, looking at economics, Pigou suggested the idea of what's referred to today as a Pigouvian tax, a tax that actually accounts for all of these externalities and somehow rebalances the disbalances that are implicit. Therefore, making it economically viable to construct in a socially, environmentally, materially, culturally responsible way, which I think is what we are all here to advocate. So that's a few words just to kind of set the framework, and I look forward to hearing the other speakers' take on this. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joseph. My name is Kelly Alvarez-Doran. I'm an assistant professor here at Daniels, and I lead the HAF Research Studio. I am thrilled to welcome my friend and my ally, Rosetta Elkin, back to Daniels. Rosetta is an alum. She's a designer and a scholar whose research is explored in the forthcoming book, Plant Life, The Entangled Politics of Afforestation. And she's also just been appointed as the director of Pratt's newly formed Landscape Architecture Department. Welcome, Rosetta.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you all for this opportunity. I think you'll find we're all quite like-minded, which means we'll have to find where the frictions lie during the conversation. For now, I'll just say, I'm not going to talk specifically about carbon, so I'll try to just twist the conversation over a little bit towards the ground under your feet. The title of this day, this conversation, comes from Aldo Leopold's fantastic treatise that still resonates. It's nice to quote and remember IPPC standards, sure. It's also interesting to remember that Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring in 1962, or that Winona LaDuke wrote All Our Relations in 1999, and that not much has changed. So with some of those great narratives in mind, which we've been invited to think about, I'll also quote Aldo Leopold. However, this quote is from his journals, which were published after his passing by his wife. And here he says, quote, "The problem then is how to bring about a striving for harmony with land among a people, many of whom have forgotten there is any such thing as land, among whom education and culture have become almost synonymous with landlessness." And so I'd like to think a little bit together about this idea of landlessness, maybe even going so far as to say that there is a common suffering besides climate change, which we can define through our extreme distance from the very land we occupy and rely on. Aldo Leopold, of course, like many who pay attention to land, to plants, soils, and waters that sustain us, describe landscape with care rather than precision, through relationships rather than numbers. Relationships are temporal, numbers are prescribed. Of course, you all know this, but I'll reiterate. Leopold sought the inclusion of plant life in particular to describe landscape in order to foster his specific kind of environmentalism that still underlines what we're doing even today in this 21st century. He produced knowledge by experience rather than expertise. Experience, not expertise. I think that's something I hope we can talk about a little bit further amongst ourselves. I wonder what my panelists think of that. Leopold praises plants for structuring the land and admires how the prairie, in this case, which is where he lived, was built by, quote, 100 distinctive species of grass, herbs, and shrub, by the prairie fungi, insects, and bacteria, by the prairie mammals and birds, all interlocked in one humming community of cooperations and competitions, one biota. So we might, as my esteemed colleague Scott says, be suffering from climate illiteracy, but we are also suffering from landlessness and a lack of literacy in describing the very plants and animals around us, let alone the thousands of microorganisms that sustain us daily. I teach on behalf of the lands, the seas, oceans, and shores that sustain our planet, on behalf of change, meaning, and hope. And I share as an educator, but I also share as a citizen, a mother, a resident, and in particular, a resident on vulnerable land, which is another thing we all share besides landlessness. My research, my work is dedicated to exploring how the complicated ties and relations made in the human world, namely between constructing a scientific truth, generating a resource, and misleading public understanding, is physically manifest in the landscape. And so what I'd like to do with my remaining moments is delaminate something that I find easily conflated in many conversations with colleagues, with students, with so-called experts in journals and newspapers alike. And this is the often unacknowledged in climate change debates as well. And it is very well known in ecology. So it is the difference between episodic and chronic risk. Okay, so chronic risk is climate change. Episodic risk tends to occur at irregular intervals, but its effects dissipate over time. The planet was formed through episodic risk. Agencies at numerous scales classify these risks as events and abate them with disaster relief subsidies and reconstruction processes. It follows that the application of fundable solutions, singular solutions to systemic problems, proliferate after a storm, an event. Hurricanes are paradigms of episodic risk, although the start of hurricane season is anticipated each June, somehow by surprise. The intensity, the angle, and the effect of a hurricane remains entirely unpredictable, as does the resultant social and infrastructural damage. Most ecology is dependent on episodic risk, as plants and animals evolved and adapted with episodes that bring landscape transformation. On the other hand, chronic risk suggests a gradual but constant duration. The effects of chronic risk add up very slowly and tend to operate along lengthy timescales, completely out of whack with capitalism's mantra of more, better, faster. Unlike an episode, chronic risk is hard to perceive, and it appears as the slow salination of the seas, the not so permafrost, the constancy of atmospheric emissions. Climate change produces charismatic events of episodic risk, to which solutions are often called upon to respond through the normal disciplinary channels, those that we contribute to, of project competitions and reimagined waterfronts. But the more essential dynamic produced by climate change is chronic and a chronic risk. So we are designing for episodes and not for chronic issues. Consider an analogy. I like analogies for any of my students here. Probably have laughed with me at my good and sometimes bad analogies. But let's consider this. You are diagnosed with an illness or a disease. The first question to your doctor, of course, okay, I'm sick, is whether or not there is a cure. A cure suggests that after medical treatment, the patient no longer suffers from that particular condition. The vast majority of cases of typhoid, tuberculosis, syphilis can be cured with antibiotics, for instance, cured. There is no cure for chronic disease. Rather, treatments enable patients to live with illness, to extend their lives by learning to manage it. Heart disease is a treatable disease only through lifestyle change that might include regular exercise and stress reduction. Chronic treatments warrant careful attention to the regimes that might have caused the condition in the first place. This usually means a closer look also at emotional, environmental, and social influences. Start exercising, don't eat red meat, lower stress. Climate change cannot be cured with antibiotics. It can only be treated. And yet, as designers and pedagogists, I won't lump all of us together, many designers are throwing cures at chronic climate conditions. Climate change is a process of chronic disturbance, and the reason it feels fast is only because we missed all the early onset symptoms. This is what happens when we conflate chronic risk and episodic risk. Policymakers, politicians, scientists, architects, and the global population must all face major changes to lifestyle because earthly symptoms are now aggravated, guaranteeing that if we do nothing, our air, our land, and our waters will only become less healthy. So maybe we can come to terms with how we manage the trajectory and take steps to treat, not cure, the accumulated effects of rising carbon dioxide and global temperatures. It's just time to acknowledge that we're in an advanced stage of a chronic condition in order to reconcile the conflicting data. And more importantly, for the next few minutes, we need to entirely stop designing short-term solutions and agree upon a long-term treatment plan. Thank you. I hope I've raised some eyebrows and hopefully we can speak further. Over to you, Sam.
This is great. Thank you, Rosetta. Please now join me in welcoming Stephanie Carlile. Stephanie Carlile is a senior researcher at the Carbon Leadership Forum, where she leads collaborative development of open access LCA data, tools, and methods to support the building sector in radically decarbonizing construction. Stephanie?
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here with all of you today. So I want to, I think hopefully also, I agree, pull on some of the strings that have been laid out there by the previous presenters and also bring us, back to this discussion of design education. So design education, I think, has been in crisis for quite a long time, a crisis of relevance, a crisis of conscience, a crisis of engagement. Indeed, many of us leave school feeling entirely unprepared by our formal design educations to practice in a way that is informed, is engaged, is ethically grounded, is technically competent, and is inspired. It's a lot to ask. And my impression of design pedagogy is, of course, shaped by my own experience, as it is for everyone who is speaking today. For all of the students on the call, I imagine that each of you has a long list of gaps and omissions that you have observed in your own design education. And I hope this reflects not just a community of disappointment, but a commitment to a diversity of approaches to design and a diversity of modes of practice long after you all leave school. For all the faculty and administrators on the call, I want to acknowledge that there is a lot to cram into 3 years of graduate design education. And I imagine some of your students will indeed expect to complete their degrees in even less time. Designers make a lot of claims about the potential impact and the importance in shaping the built environment. And so here we find ourselves attempting to hold the discipline accountable to these claims and these high ambitions. I'll acknowledge that my own view of education is shaped by my own twisty, turny path to practice, moving from an undergrad in cultural anthropology to a few years of fieldwork abroad, delving into geography and natural resource management, circling on back to the US to do my master's degree in architecture so I could learn how to actually put a building together, and perhaps also trying to be taken seriously as a designer. And then following it up with another degree in environmental science and ecology so that I could hopefully move beyond just focusing on the way things look and explore a little bit more deeply how systems work. That itself is a case study in the incompleteness of a single degree or a single methodology to ask integrated and complex questions. So now I find myself, after a decade in practice, once again a researcher working exclusively on climate justice, and more specifically on reducing the impacts of building materials on the environment and on communities. My current job at the Carbon Leadership Forum at the University of Washington, I have the opportunity to jump out of the silo of a single firm or school and work with designers from all over North America and get a sense of what they're struggling with in their practice and in their teaching. And what I see is really twofold. First, all over Canada, the US, Europe, really everywhere we look, students are demanding more engagement with climate and social justice in their coursework, in their studios, in their theory classes, in their technical courses, across the board. There's a deep desire to bring more of ourselves and our communities into our work. And this is not a passing trend. It's incredibly impactful. It is already making a difference, even if the results aren't yet widely apparent in completely changing our educational system. But at the same time, what I think concerns me the most, and what I'm spending a lot of time thinking about today, is this enormous and growing gap between our climate concern and our professional climate action. So here for a moment, I don't mean our obligation to speak out, to advocate, to protest, to work on policy, all of which is hugely, hugely important. We could talk about that a lot more, how to create that sense of agency that Scott was talking about in the conversation. What I mean specifically right now is the gap between our growing concern for climate justice, our commitment to engage in this topic conceptually, narratively, and the specific training of how to actually reduce the environmental and social harms caused by our projects, how to test design strategies, evaluate trade-offs in social, health, and justice implications of our design decisions. It's the difference between studios and theses pumping out ecologically themed projects versus training students in the strategies that actually make a measurable impact in providing rigorous methodologies for how to evaluate the impacts of design decisions, not theoretical stances alone, how to practice climate concern as an architect or a planner or a landscape architect. I'm concerned this isn't being taught in school, in part because a lot of faculty don't know how to do it themselves. They don't have that experience in practice, and they might not be willing to admit this. That to rise to this challenge will actually require a significant amount of retraining of our educators, because people are scared that the work might seem reductive or too technical or too boring, that it won't be recognized in publishing or tenure books or promotions, that some universities, there's a sense that administrators superficially applaud the themes of the work while also failing to adequately support it when the results are actually transformation of pedagogy. In my opinion, addressing the climate and justice crisis in education is not about adding a few climate-themed courses. I think we would all agree on that. It'll require changing the very way that we teach, and perhaps form a new and more collaborative mode of education. We should be willing to entertain the fact that if the way we build is broken, then the way we've educated designers might too be overdue for an overhaul. And perhaps that overhaul will result in an educational space that doesn't put history and theory over here, technical courses over there, and let studio fall somewhere in between, dabbling in both, but maybe just with better graphics. It's a funny thing. I've focused most of my career on building materials. It's just one lens, right? It's not the only way that we need to approach this much, much, much larger conversation. But I've worked mostly on building materials, focusing to pull designers out of the building, so to speak, to cast our attention to landscapes of extraction and systems of exploitation that form the basic currency of our built environment. I believe that understanding where materials come from, how they shape ecosystems, communities, building occupants is an essential part of a defensible design practice. If we're going to profit off of this system, we might as well spend a little time getting to know it critically, to expose the places, workers, economies, cultures that are masked by commodities. For that, I get paid a theory person. But I've also spent much of the last 10 years working to develop tools, data, methods, workflows for evaluating these relationships to bring environmental impact data directly into the hands of designers, trying to create spaces in which we can actually test strategies and quantify the impacts of our options, put them in perspective, rather than getting trapped in sentiment and this guilt space of toxicity and natural materials and aspirational regenerative design. I care what actually gets built, the carbon reductions we actually make right now, the toxicity that actually goes out into the landscape, and the measurable emissions that we create more broadly. And for that, I'm pegged a technical person, right? Ultimately, this urge to locate ourselves or our courses squarely in one of these stereotypical camps or another, to me, just seems rather unproductive. To close, I want to offer something perhaps a little bit more optimistic. The quickest way to tackle multifaceted interdisciplinary problems is through collaboration, not expecting every design educator to become an expert in all the specific concerns that we bring to the table. The design community is indeed richer than the stories that we choose to tell about it. There are amazing projects happening that are not being included as case studies in courses. There are far more diverse voices and perspectives outside of the university that are not currently being welcomed in and sought out. This is not a passive project. It is a much, much easier to teach a subject the same way that you were taught it. And most of us feel like we have neither the mental space nor the resources nor the support to truly reinvent curriculum, but still we must do that work. I found it enormously helpful when folks are able to create space in which they can be honest about the limitations of their knowledge and methods and collectively find ways to complement each other rather than simply compete on whose methods or whose perspectives or whose pedagogy is more valid. I think it would be incredible, and I would offer this idea to create space for that kind of exploration at every design school. Because I don't just think the solution is some magical one-size-fits-all climate justice elective that we're all just failing to insert into the sequence. Instead, I think it would be interesting to spend, to actually create time and space for all the faculty at this school to come together and really look at where there are gaps, where there are already possibilities for collaboration, what topics or methods or modes of inquiry might supplement what is already being taught. Is there a workshop that can happen with the studio, a way to bridge a theory or modeling class and bring those topics together to support thesis students with faculty from other departments and lenses and from practice? And when that work is happening, it's important that we support it, we talk about it, and we figure out how we can participate. So I think this process is going to look different at every school and with every faculty. And I know perhaps this vision is a little bit idealistic, but I wonder if it's a way to get past the scarcity mindset in curriculum development and to create the momentum and hold space for some real transformation. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Wow, Stephanie, thank you. I'd like to call back Joseph and Rosetta and Scott as well, please. And we're going to move into more of a panel discussion between the four of you. I feel, Stephanie, the question I have here for you, you've answered it in a way, so I might think about how I might rephrase this, but the question I have to you all as the first question to talk is, how could design schools teach, equip, and empower students to become, the activists, the agents of change that we need? And I think, Stephanie, you've kind of just answered this a little bit, but I think reflecting on your own teaching, your own experience to date, what can design schools be doing right now to be making this move?
Is that for me or is that open to others?
Well, I think, yeah, it's open to others. I think you could start. I mean, I think you've just laid out your answer to it in many ways, and maybe, I don't know if you want to kind of go into more specifics.
I'll pass it along. I mean, I was really inspired by Scott's words about agency. I think that might be another way another perspective to pull into this. I found that to be a really powerful way of framing the topic as well. So Scott, I don't know if you want to build on that at all.
Hi, happily. So through kind of what I did as part of a workshop was to set up a design studio. They had 9 workshops on all different topics. And I got invited to talk about activism, provocation, and anything else. So I said, I'll do it on condition I can bring an agency, because students have to be shown they can have an immediate engagement with the world outside the design studio. So it was through this that I kind of took the students through, here's where we are today, here's the disconnection, here's the kind of scale, and then said, right, what can you do and where? So really laid out and got them to look at their own lives, their own practice, and their own kind of education, and to chart where they sit in terms of things they can do personally, things they can do in their community, things they can do beyond that. So when they kind of came back, the response was, we have all these discussions, we never go out and put anything into practice. Why don't we talk to people in the street? So on the spot, I flipped it and said, right, for your research for this studio, everyone should make sure if you're working on a site, go and speak to the people around that site. So the response that came back from them testing different ways of public engagement. So instead of doing statistics they'd found online, they went and spoke to people and had really rich conversations in the street. They considered having a protest, but then decided that during COVID-19, it wasn't the best idea about a year ago. But they came back and they were really excited about what they could do and how they could engage with things. But then we took a step back and I invited them to imagine what the future could look like if they had the space in their practice. And what was really kind of astounding was it wasn't just our designs are going to be carbon zero. Some of it was we're going to do things slower. We're going to slow down the pace and more towards sort of degrowth type of kind of proposals, but giving students the space to realize that they can engage immediately. An example, I can offer another one. There's a tenants union in Scotland. They won a campaign to get rent controls for the country, which was amazing. But what they realized was if they could link rent controls to energy efficiency, they could be tackled like multi-solving. So you could be ensuring tenants' rights are looked after. So they started to put together a campaign on a just transition for tenants. So pulling together the people who are going to be doing that work. But what they realized was they didn't have someone with a technical background. So a friend of mine who works for the union reached out and said, we really need technical expertise. And that could, if any one in a built environment has that expertise, you can be going into spaces and bringing your expertise and not dictating, but listening to what the need is. And there's so many opportunities where as a practitioner of design, you can you can make that time for people, you can hold that space. During Scotland's Climate Fringe ahead of COP26, I facilitated the country's first People's Assembly on climate and housing justice. So we gave the public and people that came along the chance to try out participatory democracy, just immediate scale, just give them a chance of what would housing policy look like if you could discuss it, if you were taught about it. And students need to be engaging outside of the design studio. Every single design project needs to have not just a live build of a pavilion somewhere. You need to ground it in reality, in a space, in a place they can stand on. I was really, really kind of, Rosetta talking about our disconnection from the land, that kind of nostalgia that we feel in so many places. But if our pedagogy can now ground us back in the land around us, the immediacy around us, that's something that our agency is so much easier to tap into. If anyone else wants to take that.
I appreciate that, Scott, and I can definitely pick up. I joke around that I'm better at plants than humans, and I'm sure that's true in this panel as well. And one of the so I can't speak to all of the human to human contact you just described, but that's a lot of human to human contact. And if I think back to high school and narratives, there were always three basic narratives that were, this is also to Douglas's earlier point about language is, man to man. I use man, to mean the human right now. Man to man, man against himself, and man against nature. Those are the three narratives in every book, whether it's Dostoevsky or Rachel Cusk, right? Okay. The thing is we're still hooked on human to human. And we're still hooked on man against himself. And it's very rare to actually find more than a veil of the man against nature, because you don't feel afraid in a forest anymore because it's probably a plantation, because you're not worried about where you get your water in the morning, because you don't know the color of the sky right now. None of you do. None of us do. I can't. I wish I could. So the disconnection is so deep, and there's so much neoliberal dust to clear before we can reorient pedagogy to going outside, to having firsthand experiences, to field work without oppressing the environment, just extracting knowledge from, but learning about trees for the trees' sake and not your own ability to trade facts and identify. And it takes time, and it's anti-capitalist, and it doesn't feed off of crisis. And if I'm going to throw one thing into maybe to the next speaker, I would say that our schools have to stop capitalizing on crisis now, because it's embarrassing. It's a blatant form of prejudice. And it's a denial of change itself.
Thank you, Rosetta. Just wanted. Oh, that's a tough one to follow. This idea of the neoliberal dust. What I hear from you, and that leads to my next question, is that we taking as a premise in our pedagogies that the kind of neoliberal order is what we need to follow and respond to, right? So if it's not, right, what pedagogical changes need to happen? How do we kind of reorient and reframe that to accelerate this shift that we need to all make?
I can.
Sorry, Joseph, right before I say that, I just want to footnote. I don't think it's any, I think you're all doing incredible work. And I see so many people efforting in the university. I'm talking about the institution. And pedagogy is only a problem if it's institutionalized. Otherwise, I think we have a lot of agency. Sorry, Joseph, I just wanted to clarify my statement.
I think it's absolutely the point that, in a way, I think universities have a responsibility in kind of also towards informing the expectation, the public's expectation of the architect, and on the other hand, also I think, I mean, in very practical terms about the what can institutions do? Again, I can, my main references are my own experience as a student, which I think I graduated in 2003. So it could well be that things have changed substantially, but also in terms of my role as creative director at Design Academy Eindhoven, which is not a school of architecture, but it's still related to the field of design practice. And I have a kind of I find it difficult to believe the degree to which we are unable to reframe the kind of examples that we uphold towards students and in terms of what is supposed to inspire them. And certainly when I was a student, there was nobody who was talking about any of these things or who was thinking about any of these topics that was being held up as an example. And the problem is not so much, I think, that that stunts your one's interest, and I think anybody who is sort of interested in a socially engaged architecture finds their way into that anyway. But I think it's more in terms of feeling that that is a legitimate course of practice within the business of architecture, like setting up a studio that can expect to somehow be dealing with these topics and having some sort of expectation of surviving within the marketplace is something I think most students, as they go out into the world, feel incredibly intimidating. And that, of course, in turn leads to a kind of a suppression and an adoption of an existing model that then becomes very difficult to displace. So in that sense, I think universities, but also things like the Pritzker Prize and the Venice Biennale and all of these, the institutions that somehow form the public's expectation and students' expectation of what it means to practice architecture need radical reform, mostly in order simply to legitimize a form of practice that is not about creating a building that is going to be published in a glossy magazine and photographed, and that's the end of the story, and then whatever happens to it after that doesn't really matter, but that is able to really kind of embrace this idea of long-term thinking that Stephanie referenced, I think, and or maybe, yeah, and somehow offer that as a path. And I think that this is events, I'm also speaking from Italy, and I regularly kind of sit in on crits and reviews here in Italy. And as abysmal as the situation is internationally, I mean, here in Italy, it's like literally unbelievable, where the kind of the apex of socially engaged instruction around architecture is perhaps, I don't know, kind of referencing the idea of certain buildings made out of cardboard tubes that you can probably imagine who that is. And I really find the kind of a great frustration at the kind of the limits of imagination. I think there needs to be really kind of radical reform in that sense of offering up alternative models.
No, but that's interesting, this idea of legitimizing formal practice and having maybe realistic expectation as to what agency we have and how we can change things. I mean, there are a lot of discussion also in the context of universities, which are, in the case of the University of Toronto, a research university, right? And how does research kind of feed into these changes, not just through the training of the students, but in terms of pioneering kind of prototype new materials and things to really impact the industry. I mean, I think, has that been kind of lost? I mean, originally that was really a kind of fundamental task of universities and institutions, right, toward what we do in the industry. I was just wondering if you had any thought on that.
I think it's an interesting question that I'm like thinking about a lot lately. Is what is the most productive ways? I guess one way to frame it is, what is the most productive ways for us to work together? And I'm going to frame this in terms of architecture, but it is every bit as relevant, right, for any of the other design flavors. And in different countries, everyone slices and dices, right, landscape and architecture and planning and all sorts of different ways. What has been, I think, I have found kind of flipping back and forth between sort of a practice perspective, an academic perspective, and then more recently, a policy perspective, is that a lot of, I'll just say this bluntly, a lot of academics don't seem to quite understand what's happening in practice and are quite dismissive of it. And a lot of practitioners sort of assume that more is happening in schools, that the level and rigor of teaching is a little bit higher. And I think I am speaking specifically on, I guess, what we've kind of framed as more of this technical competency question, if we want to reduce it down to that, or make it a bit crass. But I'll be specific when we're looking at innovation around materials, deconstructing supply chains. I'm just speaking again to the kind of arena in which I work. Really understanding traceability of product and really tracking what's happening in the timber industry and the long line between forest extraction management, products, end of life, all of that, really understanding how to measure, model, thinking about justice and labor. That is happening in practice and not quite as much in academia, actually. And we seem to have a bit of this interesting blockage of figuring out how to, because I think folks in practice do not feel totally equipped to deal with these topics either. So I don't mean to imply that it's like this one-way street where academics need to just kind of break out of school and see how the world is being built. But we do, I think, need to reframe a little bit this sense of where basic research happens in the university, which work, and applied research happens in practice, because it's not that clean anymore. And it's not quite that tidy. So
it's definitely not. And I appreciate you bringing it up. I wonder if I can respond to it. Does that work with our way here? And I'll just throw out there that one of the reasons, it's many schools have become delivery systems for the professional world, transactional delivery system to make more people, to make more renderings, if we want to make it simple. And that transaction is complicated by the student debt crisis, which has surged over 144% in the last decade. So I live in the States, there's 45 million Americans in loan debt from college right now. And to the tune of like $1 trillion or something. So we can debate that, but at the end of the day, we are shackling the next generation. Mm-hmm. And we're doing that in a way that means that they have to be prepared to get a job and start to pay down those loans. As much as you will meet every curious, incredible, generous, and engaged student, you know that when they graduate, they are going to have to get a job, even if they might want to do research. That is the cycle that we're promoting and that we're part of. And so I don't always, I'm not going to blame the individual right now. I'm going to blame the institutional framework, the institutional framework. And then I wish I had more agency, Scott. All right. And I maybe you can tell, I'll put it on the surface whenever I can, and I'll call a spade a spade. But at the end of the day, there is a cycle that is very conservative, very risk adverse, and extremely linked to a market economy, which is why I say crisis funding and studios should never be linked, in my opinion, because you're doing the same thing. You're doing that exact same thing, but worse. You're internalizing it into education. You're internalizing that capital coming from. You're metabolizing it into your students in studio if it's about making the perfect waterfront. Okay, sorry, but then we're back to the engineering ideology that you all just crashed with your introductions. So that disconnect between practice and academia is actually theoretical. I think they're very close bedfellows.
I want to step in on that one because I know we were kind of put this around pedagogy, but the last couple comments have looked at this, and I do want to ask this question then, because right now we think about how our professions govern, our ability to practice in, most of the jurisdictions that you're in, and we need to go and work from gain a certain amount of hours and et cetera, et cetera. So, what are the roles then of our professional bodies regarding this question? Rosetta, Steph, I mean, you kind of touched on it a bit. I feel like you're kind of, just wrote this down listening to the last two comments, because I think, it is all one big machine here, as you've just identified, Rosetta. So, I'd be even just kind of curious, Scott, from your perspective, like, once you do graduate and you are required to go and start paying down your debt, and you are required to go fulfill 3,000 hours under somebody's tutelage, what kind of changes do we also need to be thinking at the kind of next level?
I think I'd really build upon just the last two kind of contributions as well, because with our institutions, there is this huge amount of capital and accumulation in them, and it's really transactional. Lots of the university I went to, their strapline is the place of useful learning, and it's the kind of, we were told that we couldn't have a building that used to be the School of Architecture because we did not make enough money per student per square meter. So I was seeing that before I graduated. It was like, we were told on paper, your department doesn't make enough. And there is this, again, like if we're looking at the institutions that kind of govern architecture, we are not seeing them taking a political stance. And that's what they are representing, a mass number of people. Well, I say mass, it's not comparable to, say, trade unions, not as large, but they need to be taking that form of stance, because to simply sit back at this point and say, we're going to challenge people to do better, but we're not going to say, we demand better. We know that people, when it comes to a healthy built environment, like 40% of all healthcare costs come from the built environment. They're attributable back to it. And when it comes to institutions, we're effectively, if you're working in the built environment, you can be having a massive positive impact, but that's inhibited by building regulations, by planning policy in places as well. And we need the institutions to come out loudly and strongly, because if we need an unprecedented societal transformation, we are not going to get there with ivory towers sitting at the back and expecting people to take on this kind of massive debt just to kind of be granted temporary access. And for me, it took 2 years for me to find any form of like, quote, graduate job. I unintentionally ended up in education, just bouncing around because there was a gap in climate literacy for the UK. And we really do need institutions, be they academic, professional, they need to be, they can no longer, they're not neutral ground. They cannot be neutral. There's a fantastic book, Culture Strike, that looks at the place of museums in our time of protest. The museums are not neutral ground. But when you look at any institution, you cannot sit out of what is happening at this moment in time. This is, Niall McCaulay puts it perfectly. This is the last possible moment where changing course means saving lives on an unimaginable scale. At that moment, you do not sit back and claim neutrality when you know it's indefensible. So it's indefensible at this point for institutions to claim they are neutral when, as Rosetta like out, it is so plain to see. It is, yeah, we need to see institutions engaging politically and throwing their weight around. Even if it means selling off the ivory tower, good. Sell them, deconstruct them, retrofit them, use them as examples. Don't use them as kind of set pieces. I would love to see kind of instead of having one incredibly bespoke, grand central headquarters of architectural institutions, why are they not open? Why are they not examples? We need to see a political stance. Institutions can no longer be neutral when neutral is indefensible during a climate crisis. That's where we are, and that's exacerbated by this kind of neoliberalism has left us with a culture of uncare. We don't care. We see that if people have to take on mass debt to go into education, that is uncare, knowing there's that. We do not maintain and upgrade buildings on a regular cycle when we know they do not last forever. They're momentary in a way. Looking at geological time, buildings are momentary. We do not uphold stewardship of them. So when it comes to institutions, be they academic or be they professional, there is no more time left for being neutral. There has to be a kind of proactive stance taken, and that stance has to be compassionate and it has to be one of care. It can no longer be one of sitting back and hiding in ivory towers.
Thank you for that answer, Scott. I had another sort of question lined up. I know, power to you. I had another question lined up, but I've seen a couple come in through the chat that the Q&A feature that I think are maybe a little bit more salient to where we're at in the conversation right now. And that has to do with the kind of relationships that structure contemporary practice. So far, we've been looking mainly at, the relationship to institutions with, students and educators, but maybe shifting the conversation slightly towards clients, the kind of clients who possess the capital to, structure the sort of design interventions we make. I was wondering if, one of you might want to reflect on how we might shift our idea of the kinds of clients that we engage with and the sort of relationships that we can enter into as so-called design experts to advancing different kinds of design futures, maybe more in line with the kinds that we've been talking about today so far. I don't know if anybody in particular wants to jump in there. Rosetta, take it away.
I can jump in. I also practice. I wear a lot of hats, like it sounds like everyone here does. So I think maybe that's why you guys brought us together, which is lovely. And what we talk about often is there's really only one client, and it's client Earth. And what we have to do is put ourselves between the contractors and the human client to make sure that there's no damage done to the Earth. And that I liked what Joseph said, the design without depletion, that we're leaving the land in a better state than we found it. Better, of course, being extremely subjective, but as long as we're not depleting, extracting, trading, and otherwise spraying, then we are doing better by the land that we've come in contact with and we've been lucky enough to come in contact with. And a lot of that, to Scott's point, has to do with educating the client about what they have, the human client. What is this slice of Earth you own? It's much more than your garden fantasy, and it's much more than your, Starchitect fantasy. It's a slice of the planet. And so you have a responsibility to that slice. And so we try to find really innovative strategies to sort of work around policy and create a counter narrative and sort of reframe what land means to the temporary owners we're working for.
If I could just add a few words to that, I think also, I think there is, going back to the question of policy and what the kind of the bigger picture within which the client themselves operates, I think that there is a need for sure to kind of operate a discourse of, how can I say this, advocacy towards a certain approach to building. But the reality, as anybody who practices knows, is that it becomes very quickly very difficult to advocate for an environmentally responsive, the most environmentally responsible approach when it costs like literally 2, 3, 4 times as much. And I think that some form of mitigation or of rebalancing of this needs to happen on a much larger scale to really kind of try to build in, to kind of revisit the I don't know, the policy in terms of taxation, for example, for certain processes, certain materials that are shipped from a very long way away, or that have kind of unknown origins, or that have kind of, I don't know, like we all know about concrete and the consequences of letting concrete set and all of the CO2 that's let off. But also, yeah, I mean, I think just simply trying to find ways to rebalance the playing field that will allow clients to allow architects to advocate more effectively for approaches that are completely responsible is something that needs to happen at a policy level, and therefore becomes very quickly a political question. It's not one that can necessarily be addressed from where the architect sits. And of course, I don't know whether it's certainly here in Europe, it's something that the EU is moving towards, a much more detailed analysis of where materials are sourced, what are import duties for materials sourced outside of the EU, building in kind of incentives and disincentives for the use of certain materials, for materials that are sourced elsewhere. But I think that a huge amount could be achieved simply by attempting to kind of tweak the market and to turn the knobs in such a way that it makes much more economic sense to work.
I think I'm going to interrupt you, and we should shake this up a little in the last 15 minutes. I think our attempts are over. And as an architect, I think you should stop talking about attempts, because the attempts are it's just not enough. It's not enough. I think we can't see you guys, but there's 90 students here. If we're only attempting, what are they inheriting? If you're only going to teach activism and not do it, then we're abouting again. We're back to the difference between practice and institutional kind of and energy and education. And I just want to kind of like pick up the pace a little bit for the last 15 minutes for the students, at least, and ask you. Maybe I'll just put it back, because I know I interrupted you. I apologize. It's not good humans.
It's
okay. Would you say no to a project that you knew wasn't going to do any attempting? Would you just say, no, I'm not going to do it? Because that's a form of activism. Architects starting to say no to the kind of buildings that they know are doing more harm than anything else. And would any of you just say no? Can students even imagine saying, no, we're not going to build that way?
Rosetta,
I'd just like to answer that question.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, we do. I mean, that's like what we do all the time. We work on extremely few projects, we're extremely selective. And we have a tiny practice precisely for that reason, not because we couldn't have built a practice of 20, 30 people, but because we chose to only work on projects we want to work on and to offer a model. Now, I realize that I also speak from a position of great privilege, because in order to kind of keep the lights on, I also direct a school and do other things and try to kind of, but I try to operate by the principle that it's better to do little but do it well, and to offer it. I mean, I guess my project is the little that I can contribute is to prove that it is possible to be selective, and that was precisely why I didn't throw myself into being kind of a practicing architect in the classical sense. So thank you for the question. It's a very good one. Steph.
Yeah, I just want to add on that. I agree with both of you, right? I just want to make a little bit of space too to also maybe not mislead our students. So I think that this question of the politics of refusal is hugely important. And I think everyone needs to think about that. And it's a huge ethical question for every practice to consider. And of course, we will all draw our lines in different places if we're actually honest with ourselves, right? It's very easy for me to say that I'm not going to design a prison, or I'm not going to design an airport in Abu Dhabi, or think about a large thing. It's hard for me to think about whether I'm willing to grapple with the very real harm caused by building public housing. I believe, so, right, you could come up with a million examples. And I think that for those of us who build and care about practice and want to go into practice, those trade-offs are not so black and white. Many of our projects are in this challenging middle zone, right? And as much as we need to push, so I think we're all saying this in different ways, actually, just to create space kind of in between all of this, of not to cause consensus, but to say, one way of looking at this, and I'm sorry to keep bringing it back to actual measurable change and ambition in the interest more of holding us as practitioners to task, is that we need to have a vision and understand how, to Scott's point, how every building would be net zero, not the special ones, not the fancy ones, not the ones dependent entirely on carbon offsets and exporting all of that obligation to the global south. But we also need to know how far we can get on every project, right? And we need to push. The one other thing I want to put out there quickly is that I, for many, many years, have seen architects kind of do this like blame the client thing, which I think sometimes lets themselves off the hook. I think we're in this space right now that is incredibly destabilized. We are not at a place where architects are leading on any of this. It's entirely possible that most practitioners are actually being regulated into being more climate competent, are being regulated into thinking about labor and justice concerns and ethical supply chains. It's happening across the United States. It's happening all across UK and Europe. And I think it's starting to happen more and more in Canada. It's that is real. That is not in the future, right? So when we look at buy clean legislation, when we're looking at what's happening in the federal government, when we're looking at some of the types of programs that Joseph was talking about, I don't think it's necessarily about passing the buck, but it is kind of a yes and also just to recognize that there are architects who have a wide range of clients, right? There are folks working on projects where they are prohibited from talking about climate change and justice. I also know lots of architects where their clients are demanding that they do better and writing it into their contracts. So it is a strange time, right? And where I think we need to be pulling all of those levers and seeing how to share the cases that actually are leading to real transformation and not fall into the sort of finger pointing of which discipline is kind of leading or not. So because I see that outside of this conversation, not specifically in this conversation per se. So.
Yeah, I think just to also kind of crank it up a notch, I think that if we really want to be completely brutally honest, the reality is that without fundamental, drastic reimagination of the economic frameworks within which we operate, it's actually not going to be possible to do very much. It's going to be possible to do a bit, but I think that the kind of back to the point of kind of chronic versus acute. I think the chronic is going to remain, and we're going to really be facing a situation which is catastrophic for the simple reason that outside of, since 1989, since 1992, there's basically been no opposition to the idea of kind of capitalism as the standard, as the model for human transaction on a planetary scale. And as we know, capitalism is based on growth. It's not based on even just like going and staying flat. It depends on a kind of a percentage growth on a yearly basis. Within a finite system such as planet Earth, that is simply not possible for all the amazing technology and all the efficiency and the possibility. The reality is that it's a pretty simple calculation. And I think for that reason, it goes back to the question that it's incremental remediation is not enough. And the fact then, of course, there is a spectrum of clients who are going to be some operating better, others less good, and so on. But I think that we need to kind of escape from this idea that the adherence to some sort of plan of emergency plan is voluntary, and it has to somehow become compulsory, because otherwise it's just like wasting our time. It's like there is no further space for an economy as we understand it today. It's just incompatible with our existence as a species. And I think that that's why, if we began to really think kind of ambitiously about how we can set up systems of incentives and systems of regulation, systems of kind of policy, difficult as it is, because I know if there's one thing that is difficult to change, it's politics, and to introduce the idea that, you know, like the free market has failed is going to be close to impossible, probably, especially with the political climate that we operate within today. But that ultimately is the reality. There's no two ways about it. We can be as technologically advanced as we like, but it's not going to solve the problem. And I happen to have another book that Ivan Illich, and this is Deschooling Society, but I think that his thinking, it's obviously kind of borderline heretical to kind of pull him into a conversation like this, but the idea that actually some of the kind of fundamental assumptions and principles that we as a society base ourselves on, and schools being one of them, since that's the topic today, I think is something that we really need to kind of rewind fundamentally. And if we get, and also I think it can be amazing. It can be like, think of the opportunities and the possibilities if we really kind of question on a much deeper level.
I think part of the question that the consequence of some of the questions that we're asking today are vastly beyond any one of us, which is something you raised, which is important. But if we're framing academically, sort of, or we're using the academic framework to understand where these connections have gone awry, right? And not just that they have, which is sort of the last 25 years of academia is like pointing out everything that's wrong. And the next 25 years, perhaps, is starting to tinker with that to create deeper connections, meaningful ones. And I guess I would like to say that we need, as much as we need the incentive to come from the larger capital system that runs everyone's lives, and that's a pretty big engine to tackle, we need our institutions to support their faculty to engender change in very constricted ideologies that are, to some extent, it is where we have agency, right? I mean, to your point, it's like it's easy to sort of go to the end and go like, oh my gosh, but capitalism, you know, exclamation point. But if I just trying to like backpedal a little bit and say, okay, within our context, and clearly we're all restless enough to not quite get enough from academia, not quite get enough from practice, not quite get enough from research, and want to do the little, and that's so healthy. But we're still in quite, and one of the reasons we don't get enough from academia is because it's impoverished. Okay, it is for us as pedagogues. So of course it is for the students. It is impoverished, I think, also because of this incredibly powerful relationship with all of the, you know, accreditation standards and the antiquated testing and the need for siloed courses and all of it that we're always trying to work around when we should be working around much bigger issues, right? Because the structure of the pedagogy should be allowing incredible change at a time of incredible change. And I have found, and I open it to my colleagues, that change is met with a frown in most faculty meetings. So students may as well just know that, because it you know, we should talk about it, because I want more opportunity in the classroom. And then I want that generation. This is why I teach. I mean, why do we all teach? I want to help empower the next generation to be less stuck than mine was.
Steph, I'm going to ask you to come in, and then I have to wrap things up here.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't want to do too harsh of a, Rosetta, I really appreciate that. This is going to be a little bit of a harsh turn because I want to go over, I just wanted to comment on something that was in the Q&A. I guess a bit by way of transition. I think one way, at least the only way I have found personally to deal with that is to figure out what change I can make what's right in front of me. And I know that we don't all have total freedom in academia, but I found actually no one has ever told me exactly what I need to put on my syllabus, right? Maybe that's just because of the classes I get to teach. I'm not quite treading on anyone's turf. I know that's different for everyone, but it might not always be a successful strategy to go ask other people to change their work, but bringing folks into our own classes, we have control over what we teach and how we talk and how we conduct our spaces. So sometimes that's a great space to start and then build from there with our peers and our colleagues and kind of bottom up it. The thing I want to point to was a comment in the Q&A that I think, sorry I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but I think Jenna put out there about the sort of whiplash. I hear this a lot from students, this nervousness of like, what am I entering into? Like, good Lord, I had all these exciting ideas. I'm debating with my classmates. Am I going into this like depressing, closed, hyper-capitalist system where I'm going to have to just, be a cog in the wheel? Maybe, right? I hope you get to go work. You get the best job you possibly can. But what I wanted to say actually is that almost every firm that I talk to that is honestly, soul-searchingly trying to change the way that they practice, almost every single one of those cases, and it is hundreds of firms, that practice is being driven by the most junior people in that office. And I guarantee that when you go into your office, people will be looking to you to help them design better. Now, that is too much pressure to put on young people in offices, and also people will give you a very hard time for it. So I don't want to say that that work is going to be easy. And I think part of what's also happening in a lot of the groups that I work with, Architects Declare, the Carbon Leadership Forum hubs, Code AIA chapters, are filled with young designers that are engaging in mutual aid, trying to do education, support each other because they don't feel supported in their offices. But also it's a lot of emotional baggage to deal with. So I think it's important for folks to acknowledge that, to support each other, to find your people. And also, it's not going to be easy or perfect, but I really do think that that is what is driving changes in almost every single office that I know. And finding ways to not be alone in that work is really, really important in order to keep it through, and see what you can do on your actual project, see what you can do in the day-to-day, see what you can do to connect that climate concern to the actual work you're doing as a designer on your projects. Whether it's leading a charrette, engaging community members, doing analysis, whatever the way is that works for you is really, really important, because we need everyone to be participating in this action. And I think for many of us, actually, it got better when we left school. So I just want to put that out there, right? That there was room for a lot of us to do this work and to be supported in it. So I just wanted to put that out there.
And thank you, Steph. I hate that I need to like shut this down. I'm getting my chat is popping up with, can we drag this out? But we can't. We have to go on and do other things here today. But so with the few minutes here, left, I'm going to kind of wrap it up. The first, just thank you again for, bringing your time and your energy to this conversation today. I think nothing but fantastic feedback coming up here. I think personally, I hope that we'll look back at this conversation this day at Daniels, where, as a pivot point, where we can begin to see broader pedagogical focus, around these questions and these topics. And we have an open conversation about this, that we can empower our students and empower ourselves as faculty. As we've heard, we need to reimagine our pedagogy. We need to move beyond sustainability, beyond efficiency, beyond growth. We need to recognize our landlessness and our chronic disease. We need to work together to transform how we all teach, how we all learn. And I would suggest that we at Daniels need to come together to think like a mountain to address this time of incredible change. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for Thinking Like a Mountain, Design Pedagogy for Climate Crisis. Next event is the Daniels Faculty Winter 2022 public program is Wigs and Women, Korean and Black Migrations in the American Street. It's coming next Tuesday, February 15th at 12 p.m. Hope to see you online again soon. Thank you, everybody. Keep thinking like a mountain and can't wait to continue this conversation someday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having
Thank
us.
you.